Some people disappear from your life and leave silence. Others disappear and leave you thinking about them all the time. This is not the same thing. There is a specific type of disappearance that is not an accident. It's not distraction. It's not a busy routine. It is not someone who simply disappeared. It's someone who fell off the radar at exactly the right time to have an effect on you. And if you've been through this, you might recognize the feeling. Everything seemed normal. Conversations happening, constant presence, frequent messages, a rhythm that, little by little, created familiarity. And then, out of nowhere, silence. Hours turn into a day, one day becomes two, and your mind starts working. Did something happen? Did I say something wrong? Is the person busy? Have you lost interest? But there is a question that almost no one asks, an uncomfortable question. What if this wasn't carelessness? What if it was a test? Because emotional manipulators rarely attack with visible aggression. They don't start by destroying. They start observing. Observing how much you get involved. Observing how quickly you respond. Observing how much you demonstrate emotional availability. And when they realize that there is enough connection, they create the first experiment, the disappearance. It is not necessarily an elaborate plan with a script and schedule. Human psychology rarely works like this, but there is a very clear instinct in certain personality profiles to test other people's emotional limits. And silence is an extremely efficient tool for this. Because when someone suddenly disappears after creating closeness, something happens inside the brain of the person who remains. Predictability breaks down. And when predictability breaks, the emotional system goes on alert. The mind begins to search for explanations. The body enters a state of expectation. Attention repeatedly returns to that person. You check your cell phone more often. Reread old conversations. Mentally review small interactions, trying to find any mistakes you may have made. And while that happens, on the other side of the silence, someone may simply be observing the effect. No, because all disappearances are manipulative. They are not. People really walk away for 1,000 legitimate reasons, but there's a subtle and important difference between someone who walks away and someone who disappears right after reassuring you that you cared. This difference is almost never noticed at the moment. Because when the silence begins, most people's minds don't think about manipulation. She thinks about loss. And when the mind believes it might be losing someone, it does something very predictable. She leans over. She waits. She tries to fix it. Now stop for a second and think calmly. If someone has really lost interest, why build a connection first? If someone really was busy, why disappear without any signage? And if someone really didn't want contact anymore, why do they so often come back exactly after they realize you missed them? This pattern exists, and it's not rare, because for certain psychological profiles, silence is not absence. It's a tool to measure anxiety, tool to measure attachment, tool to measure how much emotional space you open for them inside your mind. And the most disturbing part of this, it's just that often the true test is not disappearance. The real test is what you do while the person is missing. You wonder too much. You blame yourself too much. You try to understand too much. And that's exactly when certain people discover something extremely valuable to them. How much are you willing to tolerate before you realize the game you have started? Because when manipulators suddenly disappear, sometimes they aren't going away. They are watching. Now think about something curious. Manipulators rarely seem manipulative at first. In fact, they often seem like the opposite. Pay attention. Gifts, interested. They ask questions. They pay attention to details. They create a comfortable feeling of closeness. Sometimes they even seem more available than most people. And this is no coincidence. Because to understand someone, you first have to observe how they react to the connection. Social predators don't start by taking. They start by giving small doses of presence, a conversation that lasts longer than usual, an unexpected message in the middle of the day, an attention that seems genuine. And little by little, something starts to happen inside the other person. Familiarity. When two people communicate frequently, the brain begins to register that as a pattern, like something predictable. Presence becomes an emotional routine. Now imagine what happens when this routine is broken. Suddenly, without warning, silence. It's not a goodbye. It's not a clear departure. It's just an unexpected void in the place where there used to be a presence. And the human brain has a enormous difficulty in dealing with gaps. We are space-filling machines. When something doesn't make sense, the mind begins to invent explanations to restore a sense of order. Maybe he's busy. Maybe she's going through something. Maybe it's just a phase. But rarely is the first hypothesis that arises the most uncomfortable. The possibility that the silence is being used to observe you. And here, an uncomfortable question arises. As you try to understand why the person disappeared, what happens inside you? Do you feel like sending a message? Are you starting to check your cell phone more often? Do you think about this person more than you did before? If the answer is yes, something important is happening, because silence can do something that constant presence cannot. It creates psychological tension, and tension holds attention. Think of thriller films. What keeps the viewer engaged is not the immediate explanation. It's the mystery. It's the feeling that something is about to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Some manipulators use exactly this principle in human relationships. They appear, create connection, then they disappear. And while the other person tries to understand what happened, their attention gets caught up in this emotional conundrum. It's like leaving a sentence half done. The mind needs to complete. Now there is an even more disturbing detail. Often this disappearance does not last forever. It lasts long enough to take effect. Enough time for you to think. Enough time for you to miss it. Enough time for you to demonstrate some type of reaction. Because each reaction reveals information. If you send a message first, it reveals anxiety. If you wait in silence, it reveals tolerance. If you try to start a conversation again, it reveals emotional investment. And information is power. Emotionally predatory people learn a lot by observing simple behaviors. They watch who insists, who waits, who runs after. And maybe you've never thought of it that way, but sometimes when someone suddenly disappears, the question isn't just, why did they disappear? The real question may be different. What exactly was she trying to find out about you while you were silent? There is a specific moment when silence starts to make noise inside your head. At first you try to act normally. You go about your day, it works, talk to other people, do your tasks. Logic says that it makes no sense to draw quick conclusions, but something small starts to happen. A thought appears and comes back. Will he respond today? And this seemingly simple question begins to circulate through the mind like a low echo. You open your cell phone. Nothing. Minutes later it opens again. Still nothing. And even if you try not to admit it, your attention starts to be pulled towards that void. Because when someone was present and suddenly disappears, the brain interprets this as a break in the bond. And bond interruptions directly affect a very old system within us, the attachment system. Humans don't deal well with emotional uncertainty. Not knowing if someone has left or is just absent creates a strange psychological state. It's not exactly a loss. It's not exactly presence. It's suspension. And emotional suspension consumes mental energy. You start reviewing conversations. Small sentences gain weight. Did that sound weird? Did I say too much? Did I show too much interest? Notice the silent movement that begins to happen. The mind stops analyzing the other person's behavior and starts analyzing yourself. And here is something that most people never realize. Silence, when used strategically, shifts emotional responsibility. Instead of asking, why did someone disappear? The mind starts asking, what did I do to make that person disappear? And this completely changes the power dynamics within the relationship. But there is an even deeper detail happening in this process, something that psychology knows well. The human brain creates stronger bonds when emotional rewards appear unpredictably, not when they show up all the time. When someone is constantly present, the brain gets used to it. But when presence and absence begin to alternate, something different happens. Attention increases. Perceived value increases. The mind begins to invest more energy trying to understand when the next reward will happen. This mechanism is called intermittent reinforcement, and he is extremely powerful. Casinos use this, social media algorithms use this, and some people, consciously or not, use this in relationships, because when someone creates moments of intense connection and then disappears, the brain of those who stayed goes into search mode. Search for explanation. Return search. Search for signal. Now notice something curious inside you. When someone disappears after creating a proximity, you often think about that person more than you did when they were there every day. This seems contradictory, but it's not. Unexpected absence creates space for imagination, and imagination fills the void with hypotheses. Maybe he's going through something difficult. Maybe she's confused. Maybe you need space. Notice how the mind often creates narratives that protect the image of the person who disappeared. And this happens because admitting another possibility is more uncomfortable. The possibility that silence is not suffering, no confusion, but experiment. And here comes a delicate point that almost no one talks about. Some people don't just notice if you miss it. They watch how you react to the lack. If you send a message, if you ask what happened, if you are available when they return. Each of these reactions reveals something important about your emotional functioning, about your tolerance for discomfort, about your need for validation, about how willing you are to keep the door open, even after feeling an emptiness that hasn't been explained. And often, as you try to understand why that person disappeared, the most important question has not yet been asked. You're not just waiting for a response. You are, without realizing it, participating in an emotional test that you may never have known began. After a few days of silence, something curious starts to happen. The mind tries to protect the image of the person who disappeared. It's almost automatic. You create explanations. Maybe you're going through a difficult time. Maybe you're overwhelmed. Maybe you have problems that you don't want to share. And look, sometimes that really is true. Not all removal is manipulation. Not all silence is strategy. People have complex lives, real problems, moments of withdrawal. But there is a point at which doubt starts to become strange, because it's one thing for someone to need space. It's another thing for someone to disappear exactly after creating closeness. There is a silent difference between these two scenarios. When someone is just living their own life, the withdrawal tends to be gradual. The pace slows down. The answers are more spaced out. The presence is gradually diluted. But in certain manipulative dynamics, the pattern is different. First comes intensity, frequent messages, deep conversations, evident interest, and then abrupt cut, as if someone had turned off an invisible switch. This contrast is important, because manipulation rarely presents itself as direct aggression. It often appears as emotional ambiguity, and ambiguity is fertile ground for confusion. You're not sure if something is wrong. You're not sure if you should wait. You're not sure if you should ask. And when the mind is not sure, it hesitates. This hesitation creates space. Space for the other person to control the pace of the relationship without having to say anything at all. Now think about something simple. If someone has truly lost interest, why do they so often return just when you seem to be moving on? This pattern happens more than people like to admit. Silence, then casual reappearance, a simple message, "Hi, long time," or sometimes something even more subtle, a comment on social media, a reaction in a photo, a small presence enough to rekindle attention. And suddenly that question comes back. Will the conversation return to normal now? But there is an important distinction here that few people notice. Someone confused tends to withdraw completely. Someone who has lost interest tends to disappear permanently. But someone who likes emotional control rarely cuts the bond cleanly. It keeps the connection in a suspended state, not fully present, not entirely absent. This state creates something powerful, constant uncertainty. and uncertainty keeps people trapped. Because when everything ends clearly, the brain begins to process the loss. But when everything remains ambiguous, the mind keeps waiting for a definition that never comes. Now do a little mental exercise. Imagine two situations. In the first, someone clearly says, "I don't want to keep talking." In the second, someone simply disappears and then appears intermittently. Which of these two situations captures more thoughts? Which one makes you revisit old conversations the most? Which one creates the most unanswered questions? Most people have much more difficulty with the second, and it is exactly in this territory of doubt that certain manipulative dynamics thrive. Because doubt does something dangerous. It keeps you emotionally available, even without receiving real presence. And while you try to interpret minute signs, someone may be silently evaluating something very specific. How far does your patience go? How far does your tolerance go? And mainly, how far are you available? I'm willing to remain there, without any guarantee of reciprocity. There is a silent moment in many of these dynamics when something stops being just absence and starts to feel like observation. Because when silence is prolonged, two things can happen. Or the person really walks away and moves on with their own life, or she remains at some level of invisible surveillance. And social manipulators often do just that. They disappear from direct interaction, but they do not necessarily disappear from observation. Sometimes they still see your stories. Sometimes they still appear discreetly somewhere digitally. Sometimes they reappear with small, almost imperceptible interactions. Nothing big enough to resume the relationship, but enough to remind you that they still exist. This is not always intentional, but when it happens repeatedly, it starts to form a pattern. Because absolute silence would end the bond, the minimal presence maintains something much more interesting for those who like emotional control: expectation. And expectation is fertile ground for testing. Now imagine the scene from another angle. As you try to make sense of the silence, someone may be watching for signs. Do you text first? Do you comment on something online? You ask if anything happened. Each reaction reveals something. It reveals how much that absence affected you. And this information is valuable for those who see relationships as games of influence. Because manipulative relationships rarely begin with direct control. They start with emotional mapping. The manipulator watches who worries quickly, who tries to restore the connection, who shows discomfort with emptiness. And each of these responses functions as a small psychological indicator. Anxiety indicator, attachment indicator, indicator of tolerance for silent disrespect. Now there is an even more disturbing detail. Often the silence ends at the exact moment the expected effect appears. You send a message, and a short time later, the person responds casually, as if nothing had happened. No explanation, no apology. The conversation simply continues, and this is one of the most revealing moments of the dynamic, because there is an invisible choice happening there. You can ask about the disappearance, or you can accept the return as if the silence had never existed. And many people choose the second option, not because they are weak, but because the human brain tends to avoid conflict when there is a desire to maintain connection. Then the conversation continues. The subject changes. The previous silence is swallowed by normality. But for those who observe relationships as emotional experiments, this moment reveals something important. It reveals that the absence was tolerated. It reveals that the bond survived even after the break. It reveals that there is space to repeat the pattern. And when a pattern works, it tends to be used again. Maybe you've never thought of it that way, but for certain psychological profiles, disappearing is not an escape. It's data collection. They watch how long you wait. They watch how many messages you send. They watch if you show irritation, or if you show relief when they return. Each reaction builds a map. A silent map of how you function emotionally. And once that map begins to exist, the dynamics change. Because the person who understands their reactions now has an invisible advantage. She knows how long she can disappear. She knows which type of respawn works best. She knows the level of ambiguity you tolerate before questioning. And perhaps the most disturbing point about this dynamic is this. While you believed you were just waiting for an answer, someone may have been evaluating how much you can stand being left without answers. Because in manipulative relationships, silence is rarely empty. He tends to be an emotional laboratory. When people think of these types of dynamics, they almost always imagine romantic relationships. Someone who disappears after flirting, someone who creates closeness and then disappears. But limiting this behavior to the field of love is a mistake. Because strategic silence appears in many places where there is something that humans value: attention, approval, and emotional standing. It can appear in friendships. That friend who disappears whenever you start to get too close, and reappears exactly when you realize that your attention has gone to other people. It can appear in work environments. Colleagues or leaders who alternate moments of closeness and validation with periods of cold distance, creating a constant feeling of trying to regain approval. And it can appear, in an even more complex way, within the family itself. Relatives who suddenly become emotionally unavailable, and then come back as if nothing happened. The pattern, when observed from the outside, begins to repeat itself. First comes some kind of connection, then comes the silence expected. And then doubt arises within those who stayed. What happened? But there is something interesting about silence in human relationships. It carries symbolic power. Those who talk too much reveal a lot. Whoever reacts immediately delivers emotion, but whoever controls when it appears, and when it disappears, begins to influence the rhythm of the relationship. And rhythm is a silent form of power. Now think about something that you may have felt at some point in your life. When someone important leaves you emotionally, even without saying anything, something inside you tries to restore balance. You think about sending a message. Think about asking if everything is okay. Think about bringing up the subject again. This inner movement is not weakness. It is the natural functioning of the human social brain. We are shaped to seek reconnection when we perceive distance. But in manipulative dynamics, this instinct can be exploited. Because whoever controls the rhythm of presence and absence often also controls the emotional direction of the relationship. Now notice something curious. Emotionally secure people tend to deal with silence easily. If someone walks away, they continue their lives. If the person returns, they observe the behavior before approaching again. But in relationships where there is subtle manipulation, silence begins to work like an invisible button. It triggers anxiety in some people, activates need for explanation, activates fear of losing the bond. And when these emotional states appear, the dynamics change. The person who disappeared takes up more mental space than when they were present. This happens in friendships. It happens in professional relationships. It happens in social circles. And when this pattern repeats itself several times, something even deeper begins to form. A kind of conditioning. You begin to adjust to the other person's rhythm. Start expecting absences. Start accepting reappearances without question. And little by little, without realizing it, you enter strange territory. A territory where the presence of the other person is not stable, but still continues to influence your emotional state. This is one of the subtlest aspects of relational power. It rarely appears as explicit domination. It appears as something much more difficult to identify. The feeling that someone has the ability to turn their presence on and off, while you remain emotionally available in the back of the room. And when this happens repeatedly, a question begins to arise. A question that no one often asks out loud. Not just, why does this person disappear, but something much more uncomfortable. Why does her silence still have so much power inside me? There is a moment when the question changes. In the beginning, you want to understand the other person's behavior. He wants to find out why she disappeared. You want to find an explanation that organizes the story inside your head. But after a while, if you look honestly, another question starts to arise, a quieter question. Why did this bother me so much? This change seems small, but it completely alters the center of the analysis. Because while the attention is only on the manipulator, you continue to react to his game. But when attention turns inward, something different begins to happen. You begin to perceive your own reactions more clearly. Notice how that person's silence took up space inside your mind. Realize how small absences generated big thoughts. Notice how, for some time, the expectation of a return began to influence your mood, your attention, perhaps even your decisions. And that recognition can be uncomfortable, because no one likes to admit that someone else had that kind of impact. But there is an important truth here. Emotional manipulation rarely works without some kind of psychological opening on the other side. This does not mean guilt. It just means that manipulators are extremely sensitive to signals. They notice who responds quickly, who shows fear of losing connection, who tends to adapt to avoid disruption. And once these signs appear, the game begins to unfold. Now comes a simple but powerful phrase. Pay attention to her. Someone's silence only becomes a tool of control when it finds an internal space where it can echo. If absence finds someone who continues living normally, the effect disappears quickly. But if you find someone who tries to interpret every detail, every delay, every reappearance, the silence gains weight. This is not a character defect. It's human functioning. We are deeply social creatures. We pay attention to those who pay attention to us. However, when this attention is used irregularly, the mind can enter a state of continuous alert, waiting for the next signal, waiting for the next message, waiting for the next return. Now notice something important. Manipulators do not create this space zero. They find cracks that already exist. Sometimes it's a lack of validation. Sometimes it's fear of abandonment. Sometimes it's just the simple desire to maintain a connection that felt meaningful. And when these fissures encounter someone who uses presence and absence as a tool, the dynamic gains strength. But there is a point at which this dynamic begins to lose power. The moment you realize something fundamental. The problem was never just the disappearance. The problem was the meaning that silence gained within you. Because when that meaning changes, something in the dynamics also changes. Silence is no longer a mystery. Stop being a provocation. It stops being a test. It just becomes silence. And when that happens, manipulators often face something they rarely expect. Indifference. Not dramatic confrontation. No long discussions. Just no reaction. And for someone who used silence as a way to measure emotional influence, this is one of the most difficult answers to interpret. Because when the echo disappears, the test loses meaning. In the end, the disappearance itself was never the most important part of the story. Silence may seem like the central event, the moment when something started to go wrong, the moment the mind entered into doubt. But looking a little further away, something deeper begins to appear. Silence only reveals invisible structures that were already there. It reveals how we react when someone becomes uncertain. It reveals how much we need explanations to move forward. And above all, it reveals how certain presences can occupy space within our minds, even when they are no longer there. That's what makes this kind of dynamic so disturbing. Because manipulators rarely leave obvious marks. They don't scream. They don't threaten. They don't break anything visible. They just create gaps. And gaps do something curious inside the human brain. We try to fill them. We fill it with hypotheses, with memories, with interpretations. And as we do this, the person who created the void continues to exist within our attention. Now think about something that perhaps has never been said clearly. The true test of a manipulator doesn't come when he disappears. It takes place in the invisible space between disappearance and return. In this interval, something is being observed, not just if you miss it, but how do you reorganize yourself emotionally in his absence? Do you pause your own life? Do you wait? Do you try to reopen communication? Or do you keep following, even without understanding exactly what happened? This response reveals much more about the dynamic than any message that could be sent later. Because social manipulators often feed on emotional predictability. They thrive when they know exactly how someone will react. They know the person will wait. They know the person will respond. They know that the person will remain available. But when that predictability disappears, something changes. The dynamics lose clarity. The experiment loses control. And sometimes, the manipulator simply loses interest. Now there is something even more unsettling about this story. Many people spend years believing they were abandoned by someone mysterious, indecisive, or emotionally confused, when in fact they were just dealing with someone who observed relationships as a system of stimuli and responses. Presence, absence, reaction, presence again. This cycle can repeat itself many times if it is never recognized. But when it is finally seen clearly, something inside the mind reorganizes itself. You start to notice patterns. You begin to remember small details that previously seemed irrelevant. You begin to see how certain reappearances always happened at the moment when you seemed to be moving away. And then a silent understanding dawns. Maybe that person never disappeared due to confusion. Maybe he was just testing the maximum distance he could travel without losing access to his attention. This realization can be uncomfortable, but she also brings something rare: lucidity. Because when you understand that some absences are not accidents, but strategies, something changes in the way you interpret silence. The mystery diminishes, anxiety decreases, the need for explanation decreases, and in its place comes a much more powerful question. Not, why did this person disappear? But something much more important. Why would I allow someone to turn my emotional peace into a testing ground? If this reflection made sense to you, perhaps it's worth writing here in the comments. What was the moment you realized that silence wasn't just distance, but a game? These conversations matter more than they seem, because many people experience this type of dynamic without being able to name what is happening. And when stories are shared, patterns begin to become visible. If you know someone who has already experienced something similar, perhaps this is one of those videos that deserves to be sent discreetly. Sometimes a single realization changes how someone interprets years of silence. And if you've made it this far, perhaps you've already realized something fundamental. This channel does not exist to provide easy comfort. It exists to look squarely at the parts of the human mind that we normally prefer to ignore. The masks, the silent games, the invisible dynamics. Because the more we understand these structures, the less space they have to operate in the shadows. And maybe the next time someone disappears without explanation, you won't just feel doubt. Maybe you feel something much more powerful: clarity. And clarity, for those who depend on silent manipulation, is one of the most difficult presences to face.